So the big question we have to ask, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, no matter how radical it sounds, is it enough to call for police reform? Or is it time to abolish the police, and not just going halfway like Camden, but all the way to fully reimagining what policing and alternatives to policing should look like? To help answer that question, I think it is time we had a real debate. Joining me now, New York Times opinion writer Jane Coaston, who's spoken in favor of strong police reform measures, but doesn't favor abolishing or defunding the entire police, and Syracuse professor Jen Jackson, whose research includes black politics and policing. Jen does advocate abolishing the police altogether. Thank you both for joining me. Jane, can I start with you? We have seen police departments across the country try to introduce reform efforts, community policing, body cameras, limiting the use of force, limiting bans on chokeholds, for example. But things like body cameras didn't save the lives of Tyree Nichols or George Floyd. Things like banning chokeholds didn't stop Eric Garner from dying in one. So what actually works in your view? What does meaningful reform actually look like?
Well,
thank you so much for the question.
Sorry, that was to Jane. I know you've got similar names, but that was to Jane, not Jen. I'm going to come to you in a second.
Really fun. Well, I think it's important to recognize that there's reform and then there's what I like to call reform. There's the putting a black box on Instagram of reform, and that's how I see many of the efforts that we've seen from police departments that I don't think are terribly interested in real reform, especially because they are well aware that the politics of real police reform isn't on their side. For example, we've seen in this case that the police officers who murdered Tyree Nichols were wearing body cameras because they knew that they would not face consequences for their actions. Not only were they wearing body cameras, they shared photographs of his body with their friends and with a female acquaintance. And so what I think that we're lacking is the consequences. And I think that that comes back to the concept of qualified immunity, which means that for public employees, which include police departments, they are often, police officers, they are often not held liable for their actions because of a Supreme Court edict from the 1960s that essentially argues that unless a prior case has already shown that this is a deprivation of constitutional rights, how are they to know? Now, that could include stealing money. That could include beating a man to death. And we've seen in cases like Tony Timpa or Daniel Shaver, who happened across the country, that this has happened again and again.
So, Jane, a real reform for you would be abolishing or getting rid of qualified immunity. Jen, I would assume you agree with that, but you want to go further. You say abolish the police. A lot of people have a visceral reaction against that because they worry crime will go up. They worry they'll be less safe without police officers coming when they call 911. How do you respond to those very common concerns?
Yeah, I think this is an important question because it starts with understanding whether or not we believe the issues with police are systemic or individual. We can talk about Camden, but we need to also talk about places like Chicago, right? We know that Chicago, for instance, has a line item in the budget that accounts for people coming forward to say that they've been tortured and abused by police. So how do we think about something like reform in a place where they've already accounted for the fact that police are going to act outside of their jurisdiction and harm people in the community? So for a lot of activists and organizers on the ground, when we talk about abolishing, right, our idea of abolishing police stems from the idea that there has to be different forms of service and care that allow for communities to take care of themselves and not rely on police for the whole host of services that they currently provide. If there's a mental health issue in the community, like what happened with Quintonio LaGreer. Maybe not calling the police, but calling some people who are actually, trained and have the expertise to address that issue and will not escalate the situation by introducing violence and guns. Another thing that we talk about with abolishing the police is that what we're not saying is get rid of order, right? What people don't realize is that a lot of folks, especially marginalized folks, Black and brown folks, poor folks, immigrant folks and queer folks, don't call the police as it stands. A lot of folks are afraid of calling the police because of those experiences of having very simple disagreements, traffic violations, escalate to a point of murder. So when folks exhibit this kind of fear and anxiety about, who will protect us, we have to remember who is the we and who is the us. A lot of folks don't feel protected by police, and we need to extend our understanding of what police's responsibility is to our communities so that we can understand how to move forward as a citizenship.
Jane, would you disagree with any of that?
I think that I completely agree that there needs to be more available services, but here's what I keep coming back to. We have a simultaneous issue in many marginalized communities of simultaneous over-policing and under-policing. I've lived in a bunch of neighborhoods in D.C., and there are a bunch of neighborhoods in D.C. in which I've lived in which if your car gets stolen and you call someone might come like a couple of weeks from now, but there's always a cop car sitting on your block, just there, not really doing anything. And we've seen as the murder rate has gone up in certain areas, a murder rate that is impacting marginalized communities, including trans women of color. There was a woman who was murdered in the neighborhood I used to live in who I knew pretty well. And I just keep thinking about the fact that I know that there was a police car likely 2 blocks away from where this woman was murdered. And so we see in so many communities that, we saw in Ferguson that the community was basically used as a wallet for the police department, but that seemed to have very little impact on how crime was being prevented. I think that some people think that police are there to prevent crime, and some people think police are there to act as a deterrent to crime. That's what I think. Going back to your Camden story, one of the other things that Camden police did was massively increase surveillance. Massively increase the use of CCTV and just general surveillance of that community, which is deterrence. It is not prevention. It is not getting to know people in your community. It's not the kind of beat cop that you idealize. It is observing a community as you might if you were going into a foreign country. And I think that comes back to the militarization of police. But I also think that when I talk to my neighbors where I was living in Trinidad, D.C., or when I talk to folks across the country, they want the police to come when they are called. They want the police to be people that they recognize. They want the police to do what police are supposed to do, which is to prevent crime or to respond to crime. They do not want to feel as if when they call the police, they themselves are being policed, as if, why were you here? What's going on? Why do we need to do anything?
But to just pick on your point, Jane, they do still want to call the police, whereas Jen is suggesting there are some communities who don't want to call the police. And this really, sorry to make it so simple and blunt, this is what it comes down to for a lot of people who aren't following the intricacies of the policy debate. When you say the words, Jen, abolish the police or defund the police, that is the first visceral response, which is, well, who would I call if I'm in trouble, even though, as we know, most beat cops don't actually solve crimes in the midst of a crime. So, Jen, to kind of repeat my question to you earlier, how do you deal with that? Somebody comes to you and says, we can't get rid of the police. I need to be able to call 911. Right. How do you... I agree with you, there shouldn't be all these traffic stops. I agree with you, we need more mental health workers. But we still need a police force to get those murderers and rapists. What do you say to them, Jen?
So first, I want to say there are, just to be clear, there are folks in impacted communities, for instance, Black folks who very much so advocate for having police. And honestly, it's because we don't know otherwise. We've never had anyone else to call. So the idea is that if we have services that prevent crime, right? Police don't prevent crime. There's no possible way for police to actually prevent crime. When we reform police and we give them more money and more technological advances, all we actually do is increase the surveillance state and make them more agile and better at making folks' lives more difficult, frankly. So when we think about what we can do to prevent crime, right? Having, for instance, schools that are open and allow folks to come in before school and after school so they're not on the streets, making sure that there are mental health facilities in communities that are impacted by mental health concerns, making sure that people have access to jobs. There's not a huge job work spatial mismatch from their communities and their neighborhoods, right? What we do know is that when folks have resources in their communities, they're less likely to commit crime. There's less likely to be interpersonal violence when folks have what they need. So that's how you prevent the crime. Now, when you talk about calling someone when you're in need, right? This is not to say that there won't be someone to call. The answer is, rather than having someone who is armed with a gun and with the expertise to simply hunt someone down and identify them as a deviant, there will be multiple service points to tap into with folks with multiple sites of expertise who can actually address the trauma and the harm as opposed to escalating. So it's not about removing the ability to call someone, right? It's about thinking more dynamically and expansively about what we mean when we say we need help.
That is fascinating. I wish we had more time, but we'll have to leave it there. Jane Coaston, Jen Jackson, thank you both. Appreciate it.